Howdy, and welcome to the Old West Travelers YouTube channel. Today, we're heading back to early summer of 1835 near San Antonio for today's true tale of the Wild West. This is your first time here. I'm your host, Scott Winchester, and the Old West Traveler is all about true stories of cowboys and Indians, outlaws and lawmen, Native American lore, and more. So with that, let's get into today's story. On the trail that took folks west between Gonzales to San Antonio, Texas, lived a gentleman named John Castleman. Here, in this untouched land, Castleman had settled his young family. This was Comanche territory, however, and he happened to build himself a log cabin with defensive and offensive positions all around. Maybe twice a month, settlers would cross by his cabin, and they might stop for food or a place to bed down for the night. Late one afternoon, Castleman heard movement near his cabin and grabbed his rifle to see what was coming up. It was a stranger waving both his arms above his head, and once this feller reached the gate of Castleman's cabin, that feller announced that his name was Geyser, a French merchant seeking direction to San Antonio. With him, he had a small caravan of pack mules, two-wheeled carts, and a bunch of Mexican guides. Now, the Frenchman, he asked where they might be able to camp for the night. Castleman pointed the way to a small lake about 300 yards towards the Guadalupe River, but he suggested they stay the night on his property, as a Comanche War Party had been reported around the area lately. Well, that stranger and his teamsters moved down by the river and set up their wagons in a defensive circle, unhooked the mules, and settled down for the night. About now, I bet you're asking yourself, just what did this guy have loaded up into them wagons? Well, he had axe heads, hammers, casks of green coffee, kegs of whiskey, and lots of yarn and textiles. Well, dawn came that morning with Comanche war cries and musket fire. It was by chance the Comanches bumped into the stranger's campsite while the Indians were watering their horses. The camp had their rifles and pistols loaded and ready, so upon hearing the Comanches, they started shooting, sending the Indians scurrying for cover. They set up positions and waited for the attack that was certain to come. The Comanche War Party numbered around 80 men, so they knew they had the upper hand in this fight. Took their time before starting their attack. Now, they had men power, but they didn't have many guns. Most of the war party had bows and tomahawks. They encircled the camp, staying about 100 yards out to get the Mexicans to use up their ammo. They couldn't see the war party, so they would just fire any branch that got snapped, and would at times see glimpses of Comanche warriors, or, when their bullets did find their mark, they'd drop one of them warriors. Hearing gunshots, Castleman went outside to see what was going on, as his cabin sat high upon a hill that overlooked the river. He had an excellent view of the forthcoming massacre. He could see the puffs of smoke and gun flashes, plus a number of warriors. Well, that told him this was not going to have a pretty ending. His wife begged him to just leave the Mexican mule team alone for the safety of the family. So Castleman closed up the cabin and prepared to defend his property if needed. As morning wore on, just like the Comanches had hoped for, the Mexicans began to run out of bullets. The warriors crawled on their bellies to get closer to the loot. Then all of a sudden, the war party charged in a barrage of bullets and arrows. It wasn't long before the silence came over the massacre site. Soon the war cries and laughter consumed the valley. The war party looted the whiskey kegs and brightly colored cloth. There was a young Comanche boy who was last in line of the ponies heading back to their camp. This was more than likely his first raid on white settlers. He had partaken of the whiskey a little too much and found himself playing with the spools of yarn, watching them unroll as he laid down a line of yarn right back to the Indians' campsite. Once the war party was out of the area, Castleman headed down to the lake. The battle site was just what he expected, mutilated corpses still bleeding, Indian bodies floating in the lake. He gathered up his family and headed to the nearby town of Gonzales, Texas. By the time they arrived in Gonzales, nearly 24 men were in saddles and ready to head back to the massacre site. This group of frontiersmen, along with Castleman, included gentlemen such as Joseph C. Darst, Matthew Caldwell, John Davis, Robert White, Dan McCoy, Jesse McCoy, B.D. McClure, Ezekiel Williams, George W. Cottle, Andrew Solwell, Sr., Dr. James Miller, Amaron Dickinson, and several others. They elected McClure to be their captain to head up the group. They reached the scene of the massacre a bit after high noon that day. Upon reaching the site, they noticed the red, green, and blue yarn that followed to the west along the river. It took several days for McClure and his men to find the campsite of the Comanches that was high on a ridge overlooking the San Marcos River. In the center of the Indian camp, the warriors had put up a pole to perform their well-known scalp dance celebrating their recent victory. McClure would see he was outnumbered 3-1, and he wasn't willing to risk a fight without setting up a planned attack when the Indians would be breaking camp and could get them by surprise. A few days passed before McClure would see the Comanches again. The morning fog lifted quicker than he had wanted, and an Indian outlook on a nearby hill sounded the alarm as the white men approached. But McClure pulled his men back and sent Darce and Dickinson ahead to scout for the war party. The rest of his men advanced ahead until they saw their scouts heading back with nearly a half dozen of Comanches chasing them. The two scouts led the Comanches back to McClure's camp as they opened fire on the Indians, killing all of them. A few warriors put up a fight, firing off arrows, but in about 10 minutes, half the warriors lay dead and the rest had crossed the river and escaped. The Comanche left behind all the loot they had taken from the Mexicans' team a few days earlier. Now, these types of raids and battles with locals eventually transpired before the Comanche tribe was resettled in Oklahoma. One of McClure's men, Matthew Caldwell, or Old Paint, of the Texas Army, would eventually lead a dozen more of these type attacks. And some of McClure's Indian fighters would go on to fight in that old 1836 Battle of the Alamo. I hope you've enjoyed today's true tale of the Old West. I hope you'll join us next week for yet another fascinating story of the Old West. Until then.